okay, let's go back in history and look at all these different social movements, utopian movements.
Over 100,000 men were hanged because of the heinous crime of not doing jobs.
Then we began to get the idea that individual genius, artists maybe like Shakespeare, scientists like Newton or whatever, it's their genius that drives history forward.
That was a moment in history that exposed the role of economics today as not particularly different to that of the Bible in the Middle Ages.
So we're potentially facing a secular last judgment.
There are booms and busts, monopoly, inequality.
But I do think that there is something that happened before agriculture where we were experiencing reality, experiencing our place within nature in a slightly different way. And I personally think that I wouldn't be surprised if something within our DNA or something is there that is longing for that sensation of connection to nature, connection to something that's greater than ourselves, and that we have lost something. Once upon a time, we identified ourselves very much with a group and with a place, and now, of course, we've gone through family, individual, into this sort of avatar, fame world that we have today. I question that. I'm not sure that that's bringing us the intimacy that perhaps we all would like. Ownership, at a time when ownership was very loose and shared within the group. Now, of course, we have ownership of ideas and all these things. Again, I question whether that is a trend in necessarily the right direction. Economics, when we had a shared economy, and it was a gift economy, going towards now where the people in society who do the least make the most, and those who do the most make the least. Addiction, there's very little addictive traits in many indigenous groups, and addiction seems to be an epidemic in our sorts of societies, especially things, unspoken ones like greed, which are, again, I think, driving us and our society in a way that I question. Hunter-gatherers who live in a very present state of awareness, as they have to be able to hunt, are very present, and they have perhaps a different way of using their minds, their brains, that bring them a sense or a different perspective of reality that's very hard for us to understand. But I also think that there's some really interesting new ways that we can explore that as a possibility of other ways of seeing the world that may also have really, that may be very valid for us all at this time in history.
Where I start is way before 2,500 years ago. I go 9,000 years ago to Neolithic Çatalhöyük, which is today in contemporary Turkey. And the thing about Çatalhöyük, which is fascinating, is that this archaeological site has been excavated. It's built at a time where humans were just kind of on the cusp of agriculture. And people in Çatalhöyük lived in one big mega dwelling. And the way you got into your house was there was a hole in the roof and there was a ladder, and you would go into the house from the roof down through the ladder, and the roofs of this big mega city basically were a big communal living room where everybody interacted socially with each other. Now here's the most fascinating thing about Çatalhöyük. Archaeologists discovered that in these individual dwellings there are bones buried under the hearth. And now, with the technology that we have with archaeogenetics, they can actually take those bones and try to determine who these people were. So, what did archaeologists assume? Archaeologists assumed that people who were in turn buried here at the same time were blood-related kin. Guess what? They weren't, right? So, these results could be interpreted to suggest that inclusion for internment within a home was only minimally related to biological affinity. Instead, the site might have been organized by an alternative definition of kin that was not defined in terms of genetic relationships. So our very definition of family didn't apply at this particular period of time. And so what I do is to say, okay, let's go back in history and look at all these different social movements, utopian movements that decided that a group of people that were going to live together in a non-consanguineous group, so not blood-related people. And one of the most interesting is the Pythagoreans. So many of you may know Pythagoras as the triangle guy, right? He's, taught in every middle school when you do geometry, right? But what you don't learn is that Pythagoras was the great-great-grandfather of utopian thinking. He started a commune. He left mainland Greece with a group of his followers and settled what is now southern Italy in a village called Croton. And they basically lived together. They shared all their resources in common. They had a saying, I'm going to totally butcher the ancient Greek here, koineta na philon, which means among friends, all things in common. And we know from the 3rd century philosopher Iamblichus that the Pythagorean way of life influenced Plato. When Plato was writing the Republic, his ideal city of Callipolis was based very much on what Plato understood to be the Pythagorean way of living. And you can see here that Pythagoras really wanted to rethink the family structure, as did Plato. So Plato wanted to free his guardians, and this is a quote from Book 5 of the Republic, from the sort of faction that the possession of property, children, and families cause among people. If the guardians acquire private land, houses, and money themselves, they will be household managers and farmers instead of guardians, hostile masters to other citizens instead of their allies. That's Book 3. Outside of the Western tradition, the first Cenobitic monastics were early Buddhists in the 5th century BC. Cenobitic monastic are a group of monastics that live together as opposed to eremitic monastics, which are people who live by themselves, hermits. There's also some really interesting evidence about a group called the Essenes in Judea, which existed between the 2nd century and the 1st century AD. They also lived communally. They also shared their property. We also know that the Bible, this is, again, little known facts here, Acts 2 clearly shows that the early followers of Christ basically lived in a commune. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. And in case you didn't get the message the first time, it's repeated in Acts 4. The believers share their possessions. All the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. From time to time, those who owned land and houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Now, these passages in the Bible are really important to the creation of Christian Cenobitic monasticism in the Eastern Roman Empire in the 3rd century AD, which then comes to Europe. It is brought by a guy called Saint Benedict of Nursia, who writes the Rule of Saint Benedict in 530 AD, which is a text that quotes Acts and is basically an outline for how a bunch of non-blood-related people could live together in a community, together in harmony with each other and with nature.
And the ancient Athenians had a conceptualization of time which is much more sophisticated than we have today. Essentially, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, and the others divided time into 6 types of activity. The first was labor. Labor was done by the banosoi, the metics, the slaves. It was done for exchange value, and it was what a citizen did everything possible to avoid. And they differentiated between labor and work. Work was what the citizen did. It's a slave-based society, it was a sexist society, so I don't want to over-romanticize it. I'm talking about the concepts. Essentially, work was what you did with your friends, with your relatives, around the house. It was involved in philia, civil friendship. A final activity that the Greeks recognized, and this is very important to my narrative in the book, a sense of what's called eranos. Now, eranos was essentially the base of commoning, shared activities in society. And commoning and commons are the central theme of our early history. Because after the Justinian Codex, I don't want to go into details, of AD 529, there was a recognition that the commons was a legitimate form of property, and to common, a verb, to common, was regarded as a very essential part of a good society. Now, this went forward into the two constitutional documents of our state. The Charter of the Forest and the Magna Carta of November 1217. These define our constitution. And what they did was they recognized the right to work in the commons, the right to common. And all the class struggles that you would trace through our history have been about the lower commoners wanting to rescue the right to work, whereas the state and capital has wanted to enforce the duty to labor. This was the essence of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, Kett's Rebellion in 1547, the Levellers and the Diggers and the Civil War of the 17th century, the Blacking movement in the 1720s. And the class struggle that took place was between the commoners wanting to retain the value of commoning and work, whereas the landlords and the emerging capitalists wanting people more and more to be doing labor. To cut a long story short, essentially this broke down in the 16th century. And the Tudors were the instruments of establishing the base of capitalism and the proletarianization of the majority of people. And they did this through the enclosures, huge enclosures of Henry VIII in particular, and the introduction of wonderful devices like the Vagabondage Acts of the 1540s. And under the Vagabond Acts, a person caught not labouring, who was poor, the first time they did such a terrible thing, they were branded with a V. The second time, if they were caught not labouring, they were hanged. And what is not remembered in our history books is that over 100,000 men were hanged because of the heinous crime of not doing jobs.
People who focus on the Enlightenment focus on the individualism. Radical individualism is associated with the Enlightenment. My view is that human beings are social animals to begin with, who carve out room for their individualism. But because they're social animals to begin with, human beings belong to tribes. Today we call them nations. Human beings are very tribal. And when you're in a tribe or you're in a nation, your identity is inextricably bound up with that nation. You have interests, you have ways of looking at the world. You have views about what is just and what is not just that are bound up with being a member of that nation. So in the end, what that means is that sense that individuals are parts of nations and nations disagree on first principles makes it even harder to reach agreement on what are moral and political answers to the big questions in life.
And let's begin here with the French Revolution. And this began partly because in France and England, or the UK, there was a bunch of people around the place called liberals who figured that it was a good idea to have freedom of choice. And that extended from freedom to believe the things you wanted to believe and the churches you wanted to go to markets. So it was a bunch of liberals, as they called themselves, who felt free to choose, who created free markets, which ultimately ended up with King Louis XVI having his head chopped off. And finally, there's a technique involved in the picture here. Louis had his head chopped off with a new technique. As opposed to an axe wielded by a human being, there was no people involved. So 30, 40 years later, and this is Lyon, down in the southeast of France, and the silk workers are revolting. Revolting because they're being replaced by machines, okay? And they're being replaced by machines and they can see that they're losing their jobs, but they're also being replaced by machines in the sense of the idea of being creative and the idea of it being a craft is being lost. Things are getting standardized and people start talking about alienation. we are being alienated from the way we used to do work beforehand. And the ferment in Lyon around this time led to the creation of the Communist Party, which was not created by Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels, but by a man called Etienne Cabet. So this is where the Communist Party comes from. But in 1848, across Europe, beginning in France, revolutions broke out. And we've got two groups of people at this point interested in what's happening. We've got the liberals who have set up the French Revolution, freedom of choice, technology, progressivism, etc. We've got Marx taking the word communist from the Communist Party, which he had nothing to do with, but he saw as the coming wave. And both groups of people are interested in the technologies we're using. The liberals are all for it. Being progressive is about having new machines, being quick to adopt technologies. Marx is more concerned with the alienation and is aware that technologies give rise to money, and he begins to incorporate or take into account the capitalist interests that there are. But the communists and the liberals are both in favor of everybody getting the vote, both in favor of universal education. They're both seeing the state withering away. The king, the aristocratic class, the landowners, that did wither away. We're looking at what drives history. And before the Industrial Revolution, we had the idea that God's providence drives history. We kind of have no idea what's going on, but God's looking after it, and he or she has an idea about what's going on, and things will turn out for the best in the long run. Then we began to get the idea that individual genius, artists maybe like Shakespeare, scientists like Newton or whatever, it's their genius that drives history forward. With Marx, we've got new technologies which are profitable for a group of people, and you've got the idea that either the technologies or class struggles going to drive things forward. With a technology that works, you've got an if X, then Y. It's a simple algorithm, a simple reflex. But in 1990, or actually a bit before that, you've got Max Weber, whom he introduced the idea, well, we did get rid of the aristocratic class, and then we had democracy, so-called, but actually what we ended up with was bureaucracy, government by technique. You know, we set down procedures, if X, then Y. If the person ticks boxes X, Y, and Z, you do A, B, C, or whatever. And Weber was more concerned with the fact that if you've got procedures, and if this solves a social problem, well, there's no end to that, and we can keep putting procedures in place the whole time. And what he was worried about was that the paperwork will come to govern our life. And he talked about an iron cage. We'll get trapped in an iron cage. The word these days will be a deep state. And it was limitless, he said. And it was alienating just the way the silk workers thought the new machines were. Now, neoliberalism, when you read the histories, we get people referring to the work of people like Friedrich Hayek. Hayek is putting forward the idea, along with other people like von Mises and others, around the late 1930s, early 1940s, that socialism has gone too far. But they were also concerned with social democracy. They didn't think it was a great idea, and they wanted us to get back to the liberalism of the 1840s. Now, the problem, though, is they're not really trying to look at absolutely free markets in the sense that we had in the 1840s. They're looking at the encroachment of bureaucracy. But there's other things going on which makes it impossible to move lock, stock, and barrel back to the 1840s. And one of the things that's going on is the development of computers, which ran in parallel to the meetings of the Mont Pelerin group, which is the group that's usually thought of as being the people who helped create neoliberalism. And the early word for computers in this kind of area was cybernetics, looking at thermostats and taking the idea of a thermostat, a simple machine which will turn the heat on when you need it turned on and turn it off when you need it turned off. And these flowcharts became the basis for a new science that emerged after World War II, which was called management. When US troops and officers in particular came back from World War II, they were given a chance to go to Harvard and Yale and get an MBA, which is a new kind of degree put in place to help people who had been managing the troops to manage the factories in the United States afterwards. This is J.K. Galbraith, who's looking at the free markets and saying the rhetoric in the United States is all about free markets and we need entrepreneurs. But if you look at the corporations we now have and their marketing capabilities, they don't respond to your needs or mine. They give us our wants. The other aspect to them is the guys who've been through Harvard and Yale, who've got MBAs, who spin themselves as being entrepreneurs, risk takers, they're not. If you look more closely at what the CEOs of these corporations do, they're bureaucrats. And here's Milton Friedman, a totally different beast to Galbraith, on the opposite end of the spectrum, saying, you know, we've replaced democracy with government of the people by the bureaucrats for the bureaucrats. There's talk about rolling back the state, and this is the rhetoric of the Republicans these days, rolling back the state. Why there are changes. When Trump gets into power, he's not able to change the apparatus to open things up in the United States because he's been frustrated by the bureaucrats, the deep state. But equally, a lot of us would feel, well, we've got huge corporations like Google and Facebook who control us, but this is a corporate deep state. So we've got similar problems on both sides. Neoliberalism, its core bit starts in Chile in the late 1970s, where you've got inflation in the Western world. Chile has had a coup, and a dictator has replaced the elected government, and the economy is a mess between the coup, inflation, and Pinochet turns to the Chicago School of Economics, and to Milton Friedman in particular, and the idea is introduced into Chile that we can solve the economic problems simply by controlling the money supply, setting up a target, setting up an algorithm. It's rather like a thermostat. Just control the amount of money that's printed and everything else will take care of itself. Now, this happened in the UK as well. This was the other country that turned to monetarism before it gets called neoliberalism. And this was Thatcher and later Reagan. You heard a lot of talk at the time about they were both pushing deregulation, but it wasn't. The key thing here was introducing a money supply target. It's the introduction of a target. And the same kind of target-based approach was introduced in companies. There was a sense that a corporation is not just about making money. There are social responsibilities. But what was introduced was the idea that the duty of a CEO is to maximize shareholder value. Everything gets boiled down to a figure. What's the share price worth? If you have a target for the money supply or a target for the share price, it lets people predict what's going to happen next. And they can start betting on it. And you've got the emergence of hedge funds which lay bets and become so powerful that even a government can't say we're going to ignore you.
For the last 45 years, we've essentially put the individual and her preferences, his preferences at the center of the moral, economic and social universe, on the assumption that individuals left to their own devices will self-organize to find the best outcomes. Companies in the marketplace, you in society. Self-interest is part of human nature. The state is coercive. It should be kept as small as possible. Now, here's a point. I'm not anti-capitalist per se. I do recognize that capitalism, if organized well, does produce innovation, does produce growth, does produce economic dynamism. But here's the point. It doesn't self-organize to best outcomes. There are booms and busts, monopoly, inequality, and sometimes rank exploitation. It may be experimenting, innovating, and driving forward, but to serve the common good, capitalism needs guide rails, active management, and constant insistence. It hardwires social obligation into its DNA. And here's my point. I think the reason why Britain is in the crisis that we all recognize is that Mrs. Thatcher first in 1979 and then her imitators have tried to make the maxims of laissez-faire market fundamentalism that Keynes 100 years ago in 1924, in September 1924, kind of gave a lecture on the end of laissez-faire 100 years ago, kind of proved emphatically didn't work. It didn't work then, it doesn't work now. And I think there's been 4 great disasters that have actually kind of followed from trying to follow those maxims. Disaster 1 was monetarism and the attempt to roll back the state and the deindustrialization that ensued. Then superimposed on that, disaster 2, financial deregulation, Big Bang, which led directly to the financial crisis of 2007-8. And we went into that crisis with our banks more overlent than comparable banks. The Royal Bank of Scotland had £50 of lending for every £1 of capital, a 50-to-1 ratio. That hasn't been done since the dawn of time.
I think we should start, as you start in the book, at the end of history moment.
Yeah, so let's start with where, what I think is going on. There are some fairly well-known things that happened. By and large, productivity growth slowed over that period, so average incomes per head in Western countries, there are exceptions, but it's particularly important in the US, were slower than before. And that was associated, in my view, with one of the great and profound economic transformations, which is deindustrialization. And the deindustrialization struck at the heart of the social democratic settlement because organized labor had been a very important political force. They were part of the backing of, for example, FDR very powerfully, and also here the Labour government, and everybody recognized this. In the neoliberal period, not only, of course, were there attacks on trades unions, but even more importantly, there was a profound deindustrialization. Now, the other thing that happened in that period, of course, was an increased reliance on credit growth and the growth of the financial sector and its increasing dominance over the productive sector, sometimes called financialization, which is something whose implications I didn't fully understand until about 15, 20 years ago. And that had many consequences, the way corporations worked, that's obvious, the way the global economy worked. But one of the consequences is one of those incredibly visible failures of the market system, namely a colossal financial crisis. And what happened was there was a panic, the economy tanked, and in order to prevent another Great Depression, and I was involved in these discussions, basically the entire resources of the state, every state, were put behind the financial system. And everybody could see that. There was an explicit commitment that had, in my view, no alternative. We can discuss that. I have plenty of friends who thought we should have the Great Depression again because it would teach them a lesson. I'm not vastly in favor of that sort of approach to economic policy. But anyway, that discredited a huge chunk of the elite. And above all, I think, and crucially, it discredited traditional, what I would call traditional Republican views of the market in the state and traditional conservative views. And the consequence of that is populism, right-wing populism seized the right. Because the Reagan Thatcher sort of optimism about how market economies would work was politically exploded. And it took a few years, but basically that's what happened, and it's happened to some extent almost everywhere else, even in Germany now, because that story doesn't work well after a colossal financial crisis.
In order to be socially useful, economic policy makers must know not only how to set aside mathematical economic models at critical moments of decision making, but more importantly, how to be, as Keynes said, disinterested, how to be, in other words, independent of vested interests, not of government, but of vested interests. For instance, the financiers who, after 2008, bullied policymakers into adopting a cynical combination of harsh austerity for the vast majority out there and essentially socialist money printing for themselves. That was a moment in history that exposed the role of economics today as not particularly different to that of the Bible in the Middle Ages, a provider of excuses for the powerful to do as they like.
It's very clear from the analysis I report, which is based on other respects, that in the creation of our tax system, financial regulation, the implementation of the tax system, the tax burden, the regulatory structure, competition policy is a particularly important area. We have failed to prevent the emergence of a pretty powerful oligarchy. It is also true that there's now a backlash against this. I would say at the moment, so far, it's baby steps, and some of the problems of demonopolizing our economy are radically difficult structurally because we have a number of sectors, of which by far the most important is the IT sector, where platform monopolies are just stupendously powerful and they are basically shaping the economy, the information system. To take just one example, effectively, the single most important decision probably about the future of our economies, perhaps our societies, is how AI will be implemented. And that will effectively be decided by about 5 or 6 people. And none of them is in government. And I have written a column in which I say, I just don't believe this will be regulated. So I'm not at all confident about this, but I agree with you. There is some evidence that politics has reacted against this. It's not so clear here. The tax burden hasn't fundamentally shifted. Nothing radical has changed, but the debate has changed. What is striking to me is how little traction that seems to be getting politically. And I think part of that is something that we haven't discussed, but it would take a whole huge other discussion, is we don't have a media ecosphere which actually allows what's going in politics to be spread throughout the electorate. And you can't have democratic politics if you don't have some sort of machine which allows people to agree on what the facts are, what's going on. And the reality of their system, which is even worse than ours, which has its big problems, is that doesn't exist in America. So, to me, the creation of modern democracy emerged with the creation of modern media. It's always been a complicated relationship, and I'm never saying it's ever been perfect, but we have reached the nadir in this relationship, particularly in the US in the recent past, and that makes, I think, running democracy sensibly, thinking of democracy as some sort of debate within the electorate about what should be done about agreed problems, that just doesn't work.
We are in an age of uncertainty. Unlike the period of Beveridge and the welfare state, today our insecurity is a matter of uncertainty. And uncertainty for an economist is about unknown unknowns. With insecurity, the probability of you being ill, the probability of being unemployed, the probability of being pregnant or whatever, you can calculate the probabilities and have an insurance system. With unknown unknowns, You don't know, and you can't ensure. So people are experiencing incredible stress, existential stress, because more probability of disasters, more pandemics, more financial crises. And we don't have a system of social support. And in those circumstances, we should not be surprised that there's been a huge growth in mental ill health, deaths of despair, suicides and near suicides, and the loss of the capacity to do work or labor by huge numbers of people. And it's not their fault. And the state should not be resorting to more and more pressure on people who are reduced to these circumstances. Now, in the hope that one or two of you might want to buy a copy of the book, I don't want to go into the details of my solution to this problem. But I will tell you this. It's first of all about redefining what we mean by growth. It's second of all re-legitimizing all forms of commoning and care and finding ways of doing that. And third, we need to build a new income distribution system. Because rentier capitalism means that more and more of the income goes to the owners of property, less and less goes to those people dependent on labor and work. It's established. It's a global thing, okay? And this will get worse with AI and rentier capitalism and intellectual property rights, etc. We need to move as fast as possible in the direction of everybody having a basic income.
This systemic controlling way of thinking, which is that of the left hemisphere, to have maximum power to do exactly what it wants, have spawned bureaucracy and AI. And as the Greek civilization waned and as the Roman civilization waned, they didn't have AI, but they sure had bureaucracy. And it became a stranglehold on thinking, on creativity, on the sense of beauty, proportion, morality, everything. It became that covering of the world with a network of small, complicated rules. But we now have AI, which can further this. But what it has done, it's not been intelligent. All it's done is just done millions and millions and millions of processes in a thoroughly unintelligent way. And an interesting point is that bureaucracy, by the way, is not a conspiracy by a lot of people holding power in bureaucracies to control the rest of us. They themselves are in the control of it. There's something larger than us and larger than them that is controlling them. And it's expressing itself through the way the world is going. Even those plutocrats in Silicon Valley will find that they can't escape the nets that are being cast for them by their own AI. There's a sort of loss of freedom through insidious control. I don't hardly need to point this out. It's massively increased in the last 10 years through a combination of government bureaucracy and AI, aided by this little virus. And there's an important loss of trust involved in this process. What do I mean by that? A 3rd century Chinese emperor said that for a society to flourish, there need to be 3 things: guns, food, and trust. And if you have to give away one of them, give away the guns. And if you have to give away another one, give away the food. But don't give away the trust, because without trust, a society cannot function. I can see this happening around us. There are so many of us, we don't know one another, we don't even understand the ways that different people think, and we can't trust, and so mechanisms have to be set up, enormously elaborate, to stop people cheating, and then people spend all their time finding ways around the system, then somebody else has to spend even longer finding ways to stop them getting around the system. It's a never-ending process. But in this, there is no trust. And trust is extraordinarily economic. It means you can do away with whole rafts, 90% of bureaucracy. You can save us all time on the computer if we could trust one another. Then there's an erosion of boundaries. because people demand information about us that in the past we would never have given to strangers. But that's what the procedure says. And the computer says no, and so on. So you have to divulge information. And of course, we're all monitored. Those of you who are on your phones now, somebody somewhere that you don't know about knows what you're doing. This is the world we've gone into. And I think the erosion of the public-private boundary is a very serious one for human dignity.
This is the Last Judgement, and it feels a little bit like, from all the stuff that's been in the media lately, that artificial intelligence is going to make things even more efficient than they've been before. It's going to displace us from jobs and things like that. What's going to be left for us? It's making us nervous. It depends on who owns AI. AI in its own right is not just of its own accord going to solve the problem. There's a bigger issue here about, when I talk about bringing good out of the use of poison, I don't know if any of you know your philosophy. There's a bunch of different theories about evil, and one of them is there's no such thing as evil. There's good, or there's an absence of good. And evil is an absence of good rather than a personalized Lucifer. So this brings me on to this, which is, one of the options with AI is either the issue of who owns it, and the people who own it can decide there are too many people in the world and we don't want all the people that there are here at the moment. So we're potentially facing a secular last judgment, whether we're going to be in the elect who mean something to the people who own AI or have programmed it, or whether we're not. The other aspect to the creation myth, of course, is God, and this is the angel Michael killing Lucifer. You know, this is the good guys winning. Okay, let me end, I'll leave this here. I'm not going to talk to it, but it's there for any of you who wish to look at it. It's Václav Havel 50 years ago saying, you know, there comes a point where the only option for some of us is to dissent. Now, this is a very individual view, but I think what's needed is not just me or you becoming dissenters. What's needed is us together working out how to solve our problem. It's not just my problem. Thank you.